Yeah, it's on now, I think.
Yay.
Leslie, we are live. Hello, it's Bruce. Morning.
Thank you.
How are you?
Good. Where is it? Are you in China?
No, I'm actually in the Union Buildings.
Okay.
We just finished the other session this morning, and I am on and I can hear you clearly.
Okay, cool, perfect. And then we're just going to wait for the Deputy Minister, and then I think we'll get
Good.
started. Cool.
We haven't had a chance to chat before the session. Bruce, would you mind just giving us an indication how you're going to conduct the session? Will you ask us each individual questions? Do you expect opening sort of statement? How would you intend to do it?
So I'll do a brief introduction. As soon as the Deputy Minister joins in, I'll do a brief introduction. I'll introduce everybody as a broad swathe, and then basically 2 minutes each, just to give a positioning sort of on infrastructure, and then we'll launch straight into it. A couple of questions are coming through already from people who are watching us as we speak, but that's the idea as to how we're going to do it. And then wrap up by 3:30. Possibly a little sooner if we get through it.
Good. Good.
Leslie, if I could ask you to mute your mic, you're bashing things around, which is very good. Awesome. Thank you.
About that, I actually assumed I was on mute. Apologies.
Yeah, scary things happen when people think they're on mute or that the camera's off. So. If you are joining us for this webinar, thank you very much for doing so. Just give us a couple more moments. We're just chasing down two of the key members of our panel this afternoon. We may very well begin without them, Josienzo Ramahopa and, of course, David Masondo, the Deputy Finance Minister, no doubt in the corridors of the union buildings, keeping, no doubt, a good 2-meter distance between them and everybody else as we await the start of this webinar. Thank you for your patience. We'll be with you in a minute or two or three, or maybe just a few minutes longer than that. I'm not sure yet, but we'll get to you in a moment.
I'm not sure, Bruce, what's happening, because I can't hear you, but I see that you can hear me.
I can hear you.
It seems to be on the network. 1 minute I hear you and then you disappear again.
The DBSA must pay for its broadband bill, Patrick.
We have a very good broadband. Yeah, you see now I can hear you, but then the next minute you'll disappear.
Most people like that, actually.
You've gone again. My sincere apologies. I don't know what's happening here.
Anyway, if I pointed you like that, then speak. Okay.
Okay.
This is why I'm not scared of computers taking over the world just yet.
It looks like it's bound to get worse, these things.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
tend to get worse at the worst of time as well.
Exactly. Lots of demand and pipelines get clogged and it's all...
Yeah.
Bruce, maybe I should just add for you that I'm actually sitting in Dr. Ramahopa's office because we just finished the other session.
Okay.
We will know when he's ready because he will be walking into this office. Instead of you waiting on him, and given that there are a number of panelists, I think we should allow him to join when he is able to. I know that he was, accompanying the president and people to a media briefing. So, I mean, ultimately, it's your judgment. I don't want to interfere with the arrangement. I'm just letting you know that I'm sitting here in his office. He's not here, and I don't know when exactly he will be here.
I have the go-ahead. There it is on my WhatsApp. It says start with introduction. So let's start. Hello, everybody, and thank you for your patience this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the presidency, if I may be so bold as to do so, to the Sustainable Infrastructure Development Symposium South Africa. When the president announced that there would be the symposium from Teenhuis in February, I don't think he believed for a moment that something that I will represent to you this afternoon is this yellow spiky ball. It's the closest thing that I've got to anything that resembles a corona, would basically take over the planet and would bring everything all over the world to a sudden stop, and would do so decisively that economies around the world are in tatters. Now, we all know that South Africa had very, very considerable issues before we went into the lockdowns and before we were afflicted by the coronavirus. And all that's happened in the last 3 months, frankly, is things have become demonstrably worse. Infrastructure is the backbone of every economy. One of the reasons why foreign investors have enjoyed investing in South Africa for so long and over so many years and with such consistency is that South Africa's infrastructure relative to anywhere else in sub-Saharan Africa has been dramatically superior. But you can't rely on that history to keep investors sweet and to keep them coming in. You have to have superlative infrastructure, and certainly our infrastructure in many spheres has waned considerably. Electricity infrastructure is a fundamental concern. We've also got big issues with water infrastructure, sanitation, some of the very, very basic stuff that economies that are as developed as South Africa's should not be worrying about, but we do. Road infrastructure in many areas is crumbling. We've got big issues there, and certainly our technology infrastructure needs some very serious investment. When he joins us, we will get the contribution of Dr. David Masondo, who is the Deputy Finance Minister. Be keen to hear from him. Khosientsho Ramokgopa, who is in the presidency and who's head of government infrastructure. I think he is with Leslie Marsdorp, who is in Khosientsho Ramokgopa's office at the Union Buildings. Leslie Marsdorp is with us as well. He is Vice President of the New Development Bank. We've also got Patrick Dlamini, who's Chief Executive of the Development Bank of South Africa, Magda Wojcicka, who is the Chief Executive of the asset management company Signia, Nazmira Muller, the Deputy Managing Director for South Africa at 91, used to be called Investec Asset Management. Those are your panelists today. Thank you for joining us. You've got the question facility, which you should all be familiar with now, 3 months into lockdowns, and that we've had 2,000 of these meetings each in that time. Please feel free to send your questions at absolutely any point. And if it's pertinent in that very moment, I will step in and interrupt your speakers, and they will answer your questions. And I'll make very sure they answer your questions. My name is Bruce Whitfield. I'll be the chair of this particular panel this afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us. Let's go around the table, the virtual table, if we like. Maybe start with you as Leslie Marsdorp. You're dominating my screen at the moment. And give me 2 minutes of your thinking from the New Development Bank on infrastructure, on South Africa, and where we are and what we need to do.
Thanks very much for having me, Bruce. And let me start by saying that, the president, very soon, as you know, after he was elected in December 2017 and early 2018, one of his first speeches he made, he emphasized how important investment in infrastructure is to as a lever in terms of building the productive base of the economy. Because South Africa, as you know, we have been stuck as a country in a low growth scenario. And the only way for us to propel this economy forward is to invest further in productive infrastructure. The New Development Bank, as you know, was set up 5 years ago. South Africa is a member of the bank. And we started out with very modest, initially in the first year, $300 million in our first loan to South Africa. Today, we are in a position to provide $2 billion in 2020 to South Africa. We have just approved, as you might know, $1 billion a week ago that will be disbursed in a bullet payment in a matter of 2 weeks or so. And this is specifically earmarked on the public health pandemic, which is COVID-19. Traditionally, multilateral banks, as you know, focus on bricks and mortar infrastructure. We build roads and ports and power stations, bridges, etc. But as the pandemic hit the BRICS countries in a severe fashion earlier this year, we put in place what we call an emergency assistance program of $10 billion for 2020. That's roughly $2 billion each for the 5 member countries. We've already provided $1 billion to China, $1 billion to India. For Africa, we've just approved, and very shortly we will be approving $1 billion loan to Brazil. However, this is short-term, it's crisis-related. It's much more important to spend time, Bruce, on designing the appropriate economic interventions, which are more medium-term in character, because we've got to get the economy to grow again. An important point that came out of the session this morning with the president, is absolute transparency, that we are going, Bruce, into one of the most severe and deepest economic crises that any one of us would have seen in our lifetime. It's therefore very important to be transparent about the difficult times ahead, and to make the right choices and trade-offs. One of the key points that was emphasized this morning is the need to prioritize, because there are so many possible infrastructure projects. Dr. Ramokgopa just walked in, he's just setting up. He highlighted, for example, there are 88 projects ready, bankable today in South Africa. However, 88 is a very large number, Bruce, right? It is so important for us to prioritize the critical economic infrastructure that will add to the productive base of the economy and that will lay the foundations for future economic growth. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The second point I'd like to make is that now is the time also to structure and to look at our debt profile and make sure that it is sustainable. We cannot continue to borrow at the rates that we have before. We have to look for the cheapest forms of financing. Multilateral development banks, and this is my final point I'd like to make, play a very important role during crisis situations, Bruce. The financial sector, as Magda, Nazmir, and others will tell you, are very pro-cyclical. You know, when times are good, the banking sector is there to provide credit in the economy. During times of crisis, that's when multilateral banks have a very unique role to play, because our mandate is in fact a counter-cyclical one. We've got to step in and increase lending during moments of economic distress. So, for example, as I mentioned, in this year, we will more than double our lending advances to the BRICS countries relative to last year. So it's very important that we look at our cost of funding, because every basis point matters. We as a bank, we have a AA+ international credit rating, which means the funding that we raise, as we did last week, we raised a $1.5 billion bond, which we listed in Dublin on the Irish Stock Exchange. We raised that at a very, very cheap rate. There's no other local financial institution, certainly, who can provide the government funding at that level. So it's very important that we prioritize, and that we prioritize those funding sources that are relatively competitive, because the biggest risk we face now is to be in an unsustainable debt trap. Everybody is waiting tomorrow to see what Minister Mboweni will announce. But what I have seen, if it's anywhere near budget deficit numbers of 13% or debt to GDP ratios in the next 3, 4, 5 years of 100%, we are heading for deep, deep troubled waters. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie Marsdorp, very much indeed. I understand that Dr. David Masondo, the Deputy Finance Minister, is with us and has joined this particular call. Deputy Minister, thank you very much. 2 minutes from you, please. If you would, just give us a perspective from National Treasury on the state of play with respect to infrastructure.
Thanks, Bruce. I'm sorry I can't have both my voice and the video at the same time. There's some technical problem in my system here, so forgive me.
We hear you loud and clear, so go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll speak like I'm on radio.
Loudly and slowly and clearly, like that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bruce, and good afternoon to everyone. Look, I think it's clear that our economic and social infrastructure backlogs and challenges are huge in South Africa, and they are well known, they've been well articulated. And the demand for infrastructure, the need for infrastructure is also growing, because our population has grown from, if you look at the last census, we were 52 million. Now we've grown to 59 million South Africans as in terms of the population. And therefore, the demand for infrastructure, both social and economic, is increasingly growing. And the importance and role of infrastructure in economic growth has been well articulated this morning. And just from the demand side, I mean, if you invest in infrastructure, you employ people, people are able to generate income for themselves, and they're able to spend it. And again, on the demand side, from the steel, I mean, the infrastructure requires steel, requires inputs, and those inputs have to be produced by the private sector. And from the supply side, infrastructure does play a key role insofar as reducing the cost of doing business in South Africa or anywhere in the country, and thus in attracting investment. And I think the president has also indicated that COVID has just worsened our economic woes, our economic challenges. Before COVID, we still had a number of challenges, and Leslie has just reinforced that point just now. And our approach to funding has always been, we should rely on the fiscus. It has also has to be blended finance, commercial, that is the private sector, but also the multilateral finance institutions, they play a key role. And from the fiscus, as we've allocated 10 billion for the next 3 years. There's 236 billion over the next 3 years in the entire system of government, insofar as infrastructure is concerned. And I think and Mr. Dlamini, our CEO for DBSA, will speak at length about the funding that we've put together for the next 3 years. That is 100 billion put together under the infrastructure fund. Having said that, we all know that our fiscus is highly constrained, and the minister tomorrow, I won't say more about this, the minister tomorrow in the special budget, he'll indicate the situation in which we are in, which also makes it very difficult for us to even adopt a counter-cyclical intervention in this constrained fiscal environment. And I think the issues around infrastructure, yes, money is a problem, but we have to find ways of unlocking this money. And to unlock this money, we do need to have bankable projects, and bankable projects is a function of project preparation. And therefore, part of the solution is to make sure that we put together very clear bankable project infrastructure. And DBSA has an office which does deal with project preparation, and we're working very well with them. And there are issues around policy as well. There are certain projects that depend on that we've got to take or implement through PPPs, but we have to make sure that we also enforce the user pay principle, because that's the other way through which we can deploy money together with the private sector. But we have to find a way of paying for the services that we roll out in the infrastructure. And I think there's been a lot of ideas that are out there, unorthodox, unconventional methods that we need to be to put in the mix for discussions and for thinking through on the things that we basically need to do in order to raise finance to deal with the infrastructure that we have. I mean, there's an idea about solidarity tax. And I think for me, it will be important when we think about tax, not to tax citizens and business in such a way that it becomes very difficult for them to even invest the little money that they have. I mean, many of them, they've lost money as a result of COVID. So when we talk about solidarity tax, which is a tax just meant for infrastructure, we need to take into account that tax comes as a result of economic agents being able to generate enough money to pay tax. There are discussions around special bonds and how we use the current savings that we have. There are discussions around how can we make the Regulation 28 flexible to allow investment, but at the same time, make sure that we protect this in savings by our society. And I think the ideas about how we work with the multilateral finance institutions, including, by the way, sovereign wealth funds such as Temasek, Sovereign Wealth Fund, those are the ideas that we are thinking about in making sure that we get money that must be utilized productively insofar as infrastructure is concerned. Thank you, Bruce.
Deputy Minister, thank you very much indeed. And on to, I think we should go to Nazmira Mula, who's Deputy Managing Director for South Africa at Investec Asset Management. They've announced fairly recently that they will be putting together an institutional fund to invest in companies that they see as having a future to help rebuild South Africa. You've just listened to the Deputy Minister talk about things like solidarity taxes and special bonds and flexibility on Regulation 28 as a mechanism to try and raise money. We kind of betwixt and between, aren't we, Nazmira, in terms of here we've got an economy that hasn't been growing for the last 5 years. The last time we saw any decent growth was 2010, and that was World Cup fueled. We are now sitting with unemployment beginning to rise very, very sharply in an environment where government is talking further taxes on a already heavily burdened state and already some of the most taxed people in the world, more taxes to fund a solution that may or may not deliver growth into the future. Your 2 minutes, I'm going to get quite strict about this, if I may, on infrastructure, please.
Getting strict with the talking, Bruce, when you let the boys waffle for a long time. You need to be equal treatment here.
I'm going to leave the room. I'm leaving the room.
was listening to the president's address this morning, and he divided funding into three sorts of projects. And I think it provides a really good framework for us to use. The first is commercially viable projects, which can be funded entirely by the private sector. The second is mixed projects, blended finance, where you need some de-risking. And the third is projects that are going to need public financing. And given the constraints that there are on the public finances at this point in time, massive funding gap this year, I think we should start by concentrating on the first two to try and get us out of this COVID-19 recession, make sure it doesn't become a depression. And on that first one, which is these commercially viable projects, the key point for me is we need a pipeline of projects. It's easy to focus on the financing or the funding because that's the easier thing to talk about and think there's a constraint there. But actually, that's not the constraint at this point in time. The constraint is we've been talking about infrastructure for over a decade, and there is no pipeline because there's been regulatory uncertainty. We keep chopping and changing the regulatory framework. We saw that happen in the renewables program, and we actually need to move beyond that. So we need to prioritize which areas and which projects we're going to focus on, sort out the regulatory backdrop, and then allow those projects to come to market. If we talk about Reg 28 changes, I personally think there is no need for Reg 28 changes at this point in time. Under Reg 28, you can have up to 35% of the pension fund invested in unlisted debt. It's not something that most trustees easily get to because it's quite difficult to get your head around it, but there's no regulatory constraint for it. So if we develop a pipeline of projects that develops the skill sets in the engineering and the technical areas, but also in the financial areas. So there are asset managers in the country that have capacity to do these private funds. 91 is one of them, but the insurance companies as well. And more will develop if there's a pipeline of projects. Without the pipeline, there's no reason to develop those skill sets. So that is one of the key issues. And I think as we think about this, we need to make use of the models that have worked. The REAP program worked, but it's on hold. And apparently we don't want to call whatever we're going to do in renewables REAP 5 because maybe we want to change the procurement process. That makes no sense to me. So we need to think about that. And then the last point before you call time is on this blended finance idea, I think there's some really interesting things we can do there. So one of the funds we manage is the Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund, which has been something close to my heart for a long time. And that's a blended finance initiative that invests in currently 44 infrastructure projects across the continent, doing really interesting things like solar in Mali or Mozambique, water in Rwanda. And that involves government financing from various European Union governments and then some private sector financing from insurers and pension funds as well. So there's room to do some really interesting things there. If we actually start to think about it and find ways to make use of it, making use of the DVSA as well, to fund those projects that need a bit of risk taken out. Look at things like first loss tranches or just overall blended in the structure. And then that gets you to the last place where you can actually start to look at issuing bonds to finance a lot of these initiatives, because that's how you ultimately access the big pools of capital. And there we need the JSE to come on board because the current project bonds are very onerous, very limited ability for issuers to make use of them because of the requirements around them. But again, it all goes back to the pipeline. Solve the pipeline problem, and I think a lot of these other things can fall into step.
Nazmeera Moola, thank you very much. The Development Bank of South Africa mentioned there. Chief Executive at the Development Bank is Patrick Dlamini. I'm hoping, Patrick, you've had some connectivity problems. You heard what Nazmeera had to say. Your 2 minutes-ish start now.
Thank you, Bruce. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists. Good afternoon to the Deputy Minister of Finance. I'm sure you guys can hear me.
Yep. All good.
Good afternoon to Dr. Ramuhupa, who has actually done a lot of groundwork and background work to get us to this point. I think, Bruce, as Nazmeera actually and the Minister of Finance and Leslie earlier on highlighted, is we are now actually finding ourselves at a point in time where our challenges are much more bigger than ever before, at least not in the past 100 years. Yes, first brought about by the COVID-19, but then with it came the economic crisis. which brought about massive shocks, both on the demand side and the supply side. But what we need to do, actually, as we're engaging on this seat, it's going to be quite important to say, how do we achieve the ideal of well-funded projects? And that can only be a function of well-prepared projects, which then says you need risk capital, which invariably tends to come from public sector and multilateral and national development finance institutions, so that we are able to prepare these projects in such a way that they are so well structured, they become attractive to the private sector investors. Because the thing is, both government and the multilateral and the national DFIs, we do not have sufficient capital to fund all the requirements of this infrastructure. But if we can be able to really try and focus on this, what I term the tip of the spear, which is the risk capital in terms of the project preparation, it's extremely important that we make sure that we prioritize projects of the 276 projects, make sure that these projects actually are able to attract the best skill sets, because also project prep requires a very sophisticated skill sets to make them in such a way that the structuring thereof becomes attractive to the private sector. And the blend financing also then comes in to make sure that that becomes a possibility. But the skill sets which then sits also in the private sector, we need to make sure that we work together with the multilateral development finance institutions and the private sector to ensure that we are able to drive these critical and well-prioritized projects into being attractive and fundable by the private sector. So we are, as a country, at a time where the triple challenges of South Africa have really worsened. We are the most unequal society in the world in terms of the Gini coefficient index. We are sitting at just above 0.67. We have 40% of our population being said to be living below poverty line. We have actually, I think as of this morning, the unemployment rate sitting now above 30%. This is official unemployment. These kinds of challenges are saying it is not business as usual, not for this country and not for the continent, because we can see that the impact of the COVID-19 has really decimated, annihilated the national fiscus. So as a result, we need to start saying, how do we really come together very quickly with the private sector and make sure that we're able to then start prioritizing the critical projects in the agricultural sector, in the industrial development sector, as well as in the infrastructure sector, so that we can be able within the next 12 months see projects that really can be able to be brought into the market and funded and get our construction sector working. But again, we can't be talking about post-COVID, because COVID determines its own time. We need to talk about post-lockdown, because we know that within the next 6 months, we should be sitting at least a level where we need to do much more bigger things. COVID will still be with us. I can say COVID is going to be with us at least for the next 2 to 3 years before we can completely wipe it out. So therefore, prioritization and making sure that we come together with the private sector and the multilateral development finance institution and international DFIs, we can be able to see massive improvement and massive progress on the ground. Thank you, Bruce.
Patrick Dlamini, thank you very much, at the Development Bank of South Africa. I feel like you've read this book in which I talk about the fact that we need to see greater levels. Is that a free advert for the book, The Upside of Down, which is on shelves right now? I feel like finally, this is...
Bruce, when did it come out?
Hey, it came out as we went into lockdown, and now it's selling like hotcakes. But the key point here is South Africa needed a crisis to finally get everybody to begin to collaborate and cooperate. And on page 216 and 217 in the book, I talk precisely about that. The crisis that I was anticipating was not COVID-19, however, it was a short-term economic shock. But I'm delighted that we're beginning to have these conversations, but it feels so soul-destroying and heartbreaking that it has taken us so long to get to this point, and a crisis of this pandemic nature to force our hand rather than following ice cold logic. Let's go to Josiento Ramaphosa, who is in the presidency. He's in charge of South Africa's infrastructure drive, infrastructure pull, 88 bankable projects, Josiento Ramaphosa, of which, how many are truly attractive, do you think, for private investors?
Okay, no, thank you, Bruce. Good afternoon to everyone and fellow panelists, and good afternoon to Deputy Minister Masondo. Maybe just to make the point, Bruce, I think the point that you just made, that I think we shouldn't let the opportunity go to waste, the one presented by the crisis. And I think what it has imposed on us is just a more closer collaboration between private and the public sector. I mean, just to take you through a journey in the 2 minutes that has been allocated, is that when the president first spoke about the need to stimulate the aggregate demand, so the expectation was that he must produce a credible and robust project pipeline. I think the point that Nazmira was making earlier on. So when we went back and engaged with the colleagues, we came to a conclusion that the state has lost both the technical and financial engineering capacity over a period of time as a result of both objective and subjective reasons. And at that point, we then approached the private sector to say, please come and help us in ensuring that we are able to, in the shortest possible space of time, to create a credible project pipeline. I must say that the MDBs, the DFIs, our colleagues in particular, DBSA and NDB, not because Leslie and the CE are here. I mean, they've been very central in that effort, including the World Bank. And we're able to then invite projects from our SOEs and the provincial government and to some degree local authorities. And the point we're making there was that the projects must have some cost recovery elements, essentially some revenue stream, so that they can allow us at least an opportunity to package them for them to get to financial close. And we also insisted that these are projects that should not be competing for funding through the fiscals, if you like. So we were able to receive those from the SOEs. And essentially, we targeted initially four particular sectors. One, generally, is what I refer to as the network industries: energy, water, transportation, and ICT infrastructure. And the choice really was guided by the fact that they've got higher levels of multiply effects. They allow you an opportunity to open corridors, and therefore, depending on how you design them, they also give municipalities an opportunity to look at the additional revenue streams. So we're able to mine those projects from the SOEs and also from local authorities and provinces. But this is the observation that we made, was that provinces that have created some capacity at the provincial level to do project preparation and packaging, if you like, some clearinghouse, were able to submit quality projects. And those are projects that over a period of 5 months, we're able to, working with the Multilateral Development Bank, to graduate them closer to financial close. And then we have discovered that poorer provinces, and essentially provinces that have not created any form of capacity in relation to project evaluation, packaging, and preparation, they were not in a position to give us a quality project. So what is the point I'm making? The point is that the state must ensure that it designs some capacity at all spheres of government to ensure that there's some degree of skills that they are able to help in the project preparation and packaging exercise. And through the resolution of cabinet, now we've created a single window of entry. You'll find, with regards to public infrastructure projects, you'll find that the quality of projects that are coming through are likely going to be graduated to financial close. I mean, I was just fielding questions with the media, that's why I joined you late. They were asking, but of the remainder, so 88 are post-feasibility, and we're confident, by the way, I must say, about all of those projects, the 88. So it's 88 out of that 276. And we're asking of the remainder, when do we expect them to get to financial close? And I was just candid to say that I think we'll be likely to get more than 40% of them closer to financial close because of the quality of the information, just the quality of the submission. So there's additional work that still needs to be done for us to be able to improve the quality of the submission. But I guess that the biggest takeaway out of this COVID dispensation is that working closely with the private sector, we are able to graduate 88. So these are projects that ordinarily would have been competing with social projects at the fiscals. So whatever we've been able to open up the fiscal airspace so that social infrastructure project can be funded. But I think with the passage of time, greater levels of collaboration, cooperation, I think we're going to improve the skills. And then the state must look to ensure that we embed these skills inside the state so that the state on its own, if you like. And I'm not suggesting that sometime in the future we must abandon this relationship that we have forged over this period of COVID. We'll continue to do that, but the state has to invest in creating that capacity internally so that they were able to graduate a lot of these projects, Bruce.
So thank you very much. You can't have a capable country without a capable state. And then we can argue as to how much the state should be involved in the economy. But thank you, Kgosientsho Ramokgopa, who is the head of government's infrastructure drive. On to Magda Wojcicka now, who's the chief executive at Signia, private sector investment company. And also, it so happens, she claims unwillingly, she'll be the next Tokyo Sexwale of South Africa. She'll be the next face of The Apprentice in 2021, provided, of course, that you're allowed to film, Magda. But give me a perspective, please, of where you stand and how you see this infrastructure play happening in South Africa.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Deputy Minister. At the risk of trying not to repeat what some of the other panelists have already said, I think, I've been involved in the asset management industry and managing institutional assets for over 25 years. And, this concept of investments in infrastructure, I remember, the very first infrastructure fund that I wanted to start dates back to year 2003 when I was running African Harvest. And even at that point in time, I was told by my portfolio managers that, there's no point in starting an infrastructure fund because of the lack of projects. I've always commented on the fact that, in terms of South Africa, we don't lack for creative thinking. We lack for the ability to deliver on that creative thinking. So it's not the lack of project ideas, it's the delivery mechanism that's missing. And then there are 2 points that I would like to make. When I was, I also got involved, and I do get involved in lots of interesting things, but apart from The Apprentice, but I got involved in the Cape Town water crisis because I thought, there must be solutions that the provincial government hasn't thought through. And, that's where I became exposed to the lack of cooperation and coordination between the national government and provincial government in the delivery of infrastructure projects. So before one even speaks to the feasibility of partnering with the private sector, one needs to look at this coordination mechanism between the various tiers of government in terms of what projects are brought to the table for the private sector to look at. Now, in terms of infrastructure needs of this country, COVID is not a catalyst for anything beyond the fact that, never waste a good crisis. I think COVID has been a catalyst for one thing, and that is it has created a sense of solidarity between the public sector and the private sector, which hasn't been there before. So, if I look at February, there was a huge amount of mistrust by the private sector of the public sector. If I look at where we are now, and I speak to a lot of pension funds and a lot of consultants to those pension funds, everyone feels that we're in it together. Everyone feels that we want to contribute, be it in the manner of funding, preferably not in a manner of tax, but things such as COVID bonds, solidarity bonds, more voluntary than prescriptive investments. But if it is prescription, be it prescription, provided it's a negotiated prescription. But I think that that there is huge scope for mobilizing the private sector, not only in terms of the funding provision, because I think the willingness is there and the money could be found, but also in engaging with the private sector in the kind of public-private sector projects and project initiatives, so that not all infrastructure projects are driven and originated by government, that private sector has the ability to participate in the origination phase of the infrastructure projects that South Africa is looking at. So you know, private and public sector partnerships, particularly energy sector, is a very good example. So we need to focus on that first, then the delivery, then the mobilization of finance. But the mobilization of finance, you know, my concern is that the timelines, that we will waste this feeling of solidarity, that it will take us too long to come up with really investable, feasible projects before everyone is just too worn down by this crisis to actually feel patriotic about participating in government-driven initiatives. So I think the onus, and that's my final word, is on government to hurry up. You know, we've been, as a private sector, asking government to hurry up for the better part of the last 20 years. Please hurry up and come up with feasible solutions and greater engagement with private sector right at the initiation stage, not only at the stage at which you need the funding itself.
All right. Let's take that directly to the Deputy Finance Minister then. Deputy Finance Minister, one of the great criticisms of the government's post-1994 has been a lack of a hurry. I mean, there's just been this almost lethargic approach to developing a capable state, to creating the environment in which investment would come willingly. And we are in a crisis position now where the capital gets tired, bored, and distracted fairly easily. And if it's not going to be applied here, it'll be applied elsewhere. Are you committing to us today that this infrastructure project, yes, we know it is urgent, but is going to be treated with the level of urgency that Magda Wierzycka is appealing for?
No, thanks once more, Bruce. I think Magda is right. But I want to say that government's capability has been uneven since 1994. There are instances where government is doing well. I mean, some of the capabilities, SARS as an example. So I think the capabilities, there are some municipalities that are doing very well. They've implemented a number of infrastructure programs and all that. So I don't think that we can blanketly say that the state is not capable. Definitely there are challenges. And some of the challenges also have to do with misguided political influence, for instance, in project selection, and often leading to wasteful white elephants projects with little economic and social value, corrupt practices that we have seen in different levels of the state, cost overruns. Some of it comes from the poor design of the project. ESCOM is one example. I mean, at the moment, with a huge debt, insofar as ESCOM is concerned, coming from as a result of cost overruns and other poor planning, insofar as the planning for certain mega infrastructure projects. I've cited ESCOM as an example, incomplete projects. So I do accept that there are a number of issues. Some of them they've got to deal with who is in the state, how we're managing the state. And some of them, they have to deal with the fact that we really need to sort out certain framework insofar as the planning for the delivery of the infrastructure. For instance, there's no uniform decision-making process across government, as the PFMA delegates the system for decision-making to each accounting authority. And I do think that with Dr. Ramokgopa coming in, trying very hard within the current existing legislative framework, PFMA, as I said, it gives certain accounting responsibilities to different sectors of the, levels of the state. With him coming in, is an attempt by government to make sure that we are coherent, we plan together insofar as infrastructure delivery is concerned. So the capability of the state, there are challenges, but we are doing our best to correct some of the capability inefficiencies which either arise out of systems, out of the individuals who are in those particular positions. Thank you, Bruce.
Bruce, unmute.
There we go. I can't do two things at once. I was reading questions from the side and then trying to look at the unmute button. It's not possible. Sorry about that. A question from Yusuf, who basically asks Deputy Minister, is the PFMA a hurdle to innovation and development? In other words, the inability to provide unsolicited proposals has deterred investment in critical infrastructure. Is the PFMA a hindrance? Do we need to be looking at that?
I'm referring in terms of the planning that you do have a situation where an accounting officer at a particular sphere of government will say we are accountable for the delivery of the infrastructure, the delivery of certain services that were basically running as government. In this sphere, in this department. So and I don't think that the PFMA intended to make it difficult for us to deliver infrastructure. I think there are some of the unintended consequences insofar as the decision-making processes insofar as infrastructure is concerned. So, and also the planning between the local sphere, the provincial sphere. I mean, for instance, the budgets of the municipalities or local government, they are only approved around July, if I'm not mistaken. I think, and in our case, we approve the budgets around February. So there's a need for us to make sure that there's some alignment in so far as planning is concerned. And that's why the coming in of Dr. Ramokgopa and the systems that is basically putting in place is an attempt to overcome some of the legislative imperatives and delegated power to different levels of government, including department.
Let's ask you, Jacinto Ramokgopa, then again about this issue of the PFMA being a hurdle, the unintended consequences of legislation. So often, South Africa, we're very good at doing many, many things. One of the things we're particularly good at is creating multiple levels of regulation and writing really good laws, laws that often, however, can stymie progress. What's your view on that, Jacinto Ramokgopa?
Thanks, Bruce. I'll give you practical examples of instances that begins to demonstrate the level of, as the Deputy Minister puts it, some degree of misalignment because responsibilities resides with the different spheres of government. I mean, let me give you a typical example. So you find that you want to do a mega housing development, and the responsibility for top structure development essentially sits with either provincial or national governments. And through their own processes and determination, they arrive at the conclusion that they must go and do this mega housing development in municipality X at this particular location. But you find that that municipality has got its own priorities that are quite separate from what the national and province is thinking about the housing development in that area. You find that they are providing bulk infrastructure at an area that does not necessarily service this new development that is proposed by province and national. You do have live instances even here in Gauteng of mega housing development. Structures are completed, top structures are there, but you can't take occupation because there's no availability of bulk and also energy, because municipalities have got a different priority. So that speaks to, as the Deputy Minister was talking to, misalignment in the budget cycles and the fact that we don't have a single and coherent planning framework. And the introduction of the district development model seeks to resolve that question essentially. So one district, one plan. So it's provincial, local, and I'm sure when the national government descend into that space, they must make sure that the plans are properly aligned. And then the second issue that we are addressing here in the office as a part of the mandate, the principal mandate really is about coordination and alignment, is to ensure that even before people, local authorities, provinces, or even national make submissions through the process as determined by National Treasury and they get approvals, we need to ensure that indeed all the regulatory requirements are in place. So you'll have instances where people want to do a development, which development requires for the approval of an environmental impact assessment, which sits with the provincial government. Funding is made available, but the EIA is not in place. The record of decision is not in place. And if you look at the current dispensation, that period can take you up to 36 months in some provinces for you to get the EIA approval. So what is it that we are doing? I think as the office working together with our colleagues from provinces and national and local authorities is that we want to take best examples. So because I think there are pockets of excellence. Let's take the issues around EIAs. The provincial government of Gauteng is doing it exceptionally well. And in fact, they've truncated that process of approval to about 30 days. So you want to export all those experiences to other parts of the country to ensure that indeed these requirements are met. And just the more pointed question as I conclude on the PFMA being a stumbling block to innovation. Yes, I think there's a degree of merit in that, because remember that the Constitution requires that for public procurement, it must be competitive, it must be transparent, and there must be value for money. But if proofs come with an innovation presented to municipality X, that municipality is compelled, if you like, in law to say they must go out because they can't prove that you are the sole provider. That HOSI doesn't have the same idea. But remember, for you to take it out for a bidding process, procurement process, you must know what is exactly that you are going to be your specification. But because you are not the ones who has originated the idea, so it becomes very difficult for you to go out and bid it and open it up for other people to participate. So I think there has to be a rethink on that to allow for innovation, to allow for original ideas to come through, but continue also to insulate yourself from potential abuses of that avenue that you are creating. So the point I'm making is that there is merit in that point that perhaps it stifles innovation. So as we provide for opportunities to accommodate innovative ideas, I think we need to build proper parameters, or if you like, insulate ourselves from abuses of that avenue to facilitate innovation and new thinking.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Nazmira Muller, I mean, are we adequately reimagining the relationship between government and the private sector and government, whichever one has got to move first? Do we not need to be rethinking the relationship, the way it works? I mean, there's been so much abuse of trust over the years. We've seen many players in the private sector run rings around government and process and protocols, deliberately manipulate for their own good. I'll say Gupta, nobody else will. For example, in terms of procurement of things like coal for Eskom and for other contracts and pivotal contracts as well. The reason why we have such tough regulation is because we've seen so many abuses. How do we reimagine a relationship of trust, of collaboration, of cooperation that gets this bus moving before the bus station falls down out of old age, for want of a better analogy?
Bruce, I think it's a sequencing issue. So I think the first is to build on what has worked, the REAP program, the toll road program in the late 90s. I mean, there's a great example there. The N4 was built. 20 years later, it's being handed back to government, and government can reconcession it and get 8 billion rands out of it, maybe more. So, they're great examples that we have. So make use of what we've got for the short term. To Magda's point, we need some tangible progress relatively quickly. But I think in the longer term, there is room to be much more creative. So as municipalities grapple with the fact that they have funding constraints and they don't have any, and they also have severe skills constraints, as they get the private sector involved in things like waste treatment and water treatment. So our traditional model was always the public sector says we need a new waste treatment plant and here is a piece of land and puts that out to tender. But I think there's a model to say, okay, we need to treat X million kiloliters of waste. What are the options? And provided the government is able to say, this is the framework that it needs to happen in, this is the cost that I'm prepared to pay, I think you could get some really interesting solutions that come out of that. The reason I say sequencing, though, is that requires a capacity within municipalities to evaluate that, and we know that isn't there at the moment. So I think we need to start with the easier wins in the short term, but look to build up to something where we are much less prescriptive in terms of what needs to be done, because I think there are much better and cheaper options available if we provide room for that.
Thank you, Nazmira Mula. On to you, Magda Wojcicka, just in terms of another one of the questions that has come through to us this afternoon, in terms of the use of retirement funds, how do we make it easier for defined contribution retirement funds using pooled off-the-shelf investment portfolios to increase investments in infrastructure projects? I mean, the use of pension money, it makes your blood run cold when you look at the track record of how government has spent money in the past decade or two as to what the future may look like. And we've got to have some degree of faith in the future. But when it comes to spending pension money, a lot of people get really nervous about that. How do we do it more effectively?
I think Bruce, there are two things. So when you look at pension fund money and pension savings, the main objective of an individual or a board of trustees is to maximize returns. So provided that the projects that are put on the table provide reasonable level of return, and I say reasonable because in this COVID environment, that's where my kind of sense of solidarity comes to the fore. It doesn't have to be extraordinary return. It just has to be a reasonable return. Then I think you can mobilize funding. Sometimes you might have to, in order to ensure that what you don't do is, again, in defined contribution funds where you've got this allocation between bonds and equities and offshore, in order to ensure that what you don't do is you don't reallocate funding. So money that's currently allocated to government bond exposure suddenly gets reallocated to some infrastructure spend, but actually government has, you're just moving money between two pockets. You're not gaining a net benefit from savers being willing to commit more money to infrastructure bonds of fixed term investments. You need to look at possibly reaching some form of compromise with retirement funds. And here I talk to both retirement annuity holders as well as retirement funds. And it could take the form of, for instance, saying, we will be prescriptive on prescribing that 5% of your savings goes towards particular COVID bond, call it, or a solidarity bond, which will then be deployed towards infrastructure spend. And that will be, longer term, possibly less liquid investment. In exchange for that, we will increase your offshore allocation. So instead of being limited to 30% offshore exposure, we will allow you to invest 40% of your money offshore. And, interestingly enough, people probably will never use that 40% allocation, but there's a little bit of a quid pro quo in, so it isn't seen as a prescription. It is seen as a negotiation and a quid pro quo mechanism, because the worst case situation is one where either you prescribe and that's I think it's very difficult to actually achieve in a defined contribution world, because I can envisage multiple court cases, not only in terms of members of retirement funds and boards of trustees, but also GEPF. If you actually study the act under which GEPF is run, that's also very strictly regulated in terms of how the money can be deployed and how members can sue. And I know that they've got a very active pensioner community that would immediately start looking at court cases. So it needs to be, so the defined contribution world is very different to the defined benefit world, which existed under the apartheid regime, which enabled the apartheid regime to implement prescribed asset requirements. So you actually need to come to kind of a consensus and a negotiated consensus between the retirement fund industry and government in terms of how to deploy savings. But the one thing that I can say is, and I've done a bit of a dipstick test around the market among large institutional investors, there is certainly a willingness among retirement funds, and I can't talk to the retail market, which, individual investors are a different beast, but institutional investors, where there is a willingness to collaborate with government in terms of the Regulation 28 framework to deploy money in order to reach some kind of, solution to the crisis that we face currently. So it's not all bad, but it needs to be a negotiated route rather than kind of start with prescription.
Thank you, Magda. I mean, Nazmira, before we go to somebody else, just a quick thought from you on retail funds. You guys have got a big retail business, of course, Nazmira. Retail investors, could we not be asked to volunteer some of our savings to big national projects?
I think you need to make it attractive. So I think that if you look at the 12J structures that were introduced, which were used to finance all sorts of things, I think that there's room to introduce some tax incentive in the retail market to support infrastructure. The US has done this very successfully. So look at infrastructure bonds. You could fund things like social housing doing that. So I think there is room to do that. I think the other thing the retail needs to look at in the unit trust space, as opposed to in the issuance space, is some sort of longer term vehicles. So I know the FSCA is generally very conservative, and I think there is a concern on how these things could be manipulated. But I think in this environment, if you want to mobilize the retail market into infrastructure or for things like the recovery fund that we spoke about earlier on, is we need to think about longer term vehicles that don't have a daily dealing requirement, because you can't finance infrastructure with a daily dealing requirement. So that is one area where I think we do perhaps need to look at it.
Lovely, thank you. Let's get you involved in here, Leslie Marsdorp. I mean, when it comes to bankability versus technical solutions, Leslie Marsdorp, I mean, do we focus too much on technical solutions than bankability? How do we bring the private sector more in from the beginning of projects rather than as an afterthought?
I think there's complete consensus, Bruce, on that issue, that we need to spend considerable more time on having a huge pipeline of bankable projects. A number of the panelists have already sort of highlighted that. But how does one do that? I think it's very important that we begin to pool the various capabilities that exist. Patrick will tell you that the DBSA has a project preparation facility. We as a bank also have a project preparation fund. Africa Development Bank have a similar fund, and so on. I think it's very important that we begin to collaborate more at that conceptual stage, and also bring in private actors and private investors in infrastructure right from the outset. I think all of us, there's complete consensus on that. The second point I'd like to make, and this is also very important, that we shouldn't just focus on infrastructure more generally. It should be rooted in what are the comparative and competitive advantages of the South African economy. I'll give you one little example. We all know, I would argue, that the most successful program in the last decade or so in South Africa has been the renewable energy program. Okay, we have world-class capability, and we can deepen and strengthen that world-class capability in the renewable energy space. We have all the ingredients to make that happen. We now have to get a new round going, and we need to do that with speed. Secondly, we know already that South Africa's energy sort of investment cannot continue in coal-based, fossil fuel-based inputs. So there's a major energy transition that needs to happen. The private sector can play a very, very critical role in enabling that sort of transition towards more greener forms of energy. So what we should look at is not just infrastructure in general, but what are the areas in which we can build long-term industrial capacity and capability? Because unfortunately, Bruce, there's going to be a lot of culling of jobs in South Africa in the next number of years to come. Forget about COVID, beyond COVID. In the coal space, for example, it is impossible to fund projects these days. We should now be investing in industries of the future. In battery storage, for example, we have some of the minerals that is required in the battery storage. We should be looking at the production of these batteries for electric vehicles. In China, this is what people talk about every day. It's about the industries of tomorrow. There's a much bigger focus on artificial intelligence and robotics and the sort of new tech because they've got such massive capability in already. There are areas where we have capability in, and I would say renewable energy is certainly one. The minerals complex around sort of battery storage, we can play a significant role in electric vehicles, given our strong automotive sector. So in addition to your question, which was about the project preparation, I think we should also begin to specialize in those areas where we can build long-term world-class capability.
Let's go to you, Patrick Dlamini. I mean, just in terms of regulation, it's something that Nazmeera Moola raised earlier about the moving goalposts of regulation. When I was in Davos, and I've become that person who says, when I was in Davos, I was very lucky to get into a room with a bunch of foreign investors, only a very small bunch. The finance minister was there. We had Naledi Pandor in the room. We had Abraham Patel in the room as well. And uniformly, the 5 or 6 investors who were there, including the chief financial officer of Heineken, was there, and she was quite agitated, one, about power cuts. She was also very agitated about the regulatory framework. And her observation is similar to Nazmeera's. The stop-start nature of South Africa's regulatory framework is something that is so deeply damaging to sentiment. I mean, as the Development Bank of South Africa, surely it's this regulatory framework that urgently needs review.
Absolutely, Bruce. I think it's quite key that when we come up with regulation, we ought to ask ourselves, what is the primary reason of this regulation? We should not be coming up with regulation to stop the thieves. We're supposed to be coming up with regulation to enable investment and to create the right safeguards for investors to have the sense of comfort. Because when you start coming up with regulation because you're anticipating thieving, then you're going to create a massive problem where you then paralyze everyone, where you then make it very difficult for people to see through that regulation. The regulation that we need to be in place are the regulations that actually are protecting the investors, are the regulations that are promoting the investment into the economy, are the regulations that are saying how do we make sure that there is transformation for the people of the country, that there are job creation for the people of the country, and that there is a system where if there are disputes, people can be able to resolve the dispute much more easier, and the rule of law is in place and it's well supported. That is quite important. But unfortunately, especially as you talk about the renewable energy, I think the biggest challenge there was the stop-start, which actually made it difficult for the localization to be sustainable. Because as people were putting their money to invest in the local capacity to produce the right content for the renewable energy, we had some massive delays, which then led for those local content and local industrialization to then sit idle in order to start incurring massive losses, which was not a good thing for the investors to be actually stuck with. So it's very, very, very important that when we come up with regulation, it's supposed to be creating the right environment. It's supposed to be creating the enabling environment. It's supposed to be bringing in the safeguard, the required safeguards by the investors, so that we can be able to be competitive as a country. We can be able to see various investments then facilitated into the economy much more stronger. I think that is very, very important. You spoke about the PFMA. Yes, the PFMA has led to a number of unintended consequences, what we call policy resistance in economics. But again, how do we then look back and say, guys, what is it then that we then get to address? So that at least you take out those bottlenecks in the economy and be able to say, thieves, there is a criminal justice system that is going to deal with them, and it's got to be effective. You cannot be trying to police everything and everywhere because you have that fear of thieving. I think that is how actually I simplify your question on regulation. But really, regulation has got to be about the primary purpose that actually we're putting them in place for. In the context
again,
of investments.
With a strong and enabled and capacitated prosecuting authority, you don't need new regulation. You just need to enforce what you've got in place, and the bad guys go to jail, and eventually the system sorts itself out. You don't keep reinventing the wheel all the time. Ramaphosa, why is it different this time? I know it's the most dangerous phrase in the English language, but why is it different this time? I know we have no choice and it has to be different this time, but why is it different this time from a trust point of view, from a capacity point of view, from a capital point of view, and from a needs point of view?
No, Bruce, I think it's a valid question that you are raising. Well, the first one is that I think we didn't have a choice, but COVID almost imposed this requirement on us that essentially we are confronted with a national problem, and therefore it can't just be public sector or private sector on their own. I think we need to ensure that we find a point of intersection, a meeting point to work together. And then the second one is that I think it's Nazmira who made the point earlier on, is that the private sector also thrives on the existence of a credible project pipeline that has got a long time horizon, so that they are able to see way into the future and they are able to prepare themselves, scale up now, invest almost immediately. So it's if you like, a symbiotic relationship that the private sector thrives on the existence of a credible project pipeline. The public sector, depending on the sectors that you have chosen and the quality of the investment, you are likely going to attain your socio-economic goals. So if you like, this gets to be imposed on us, and that's how we're able to find each other. And then the second one is that I think there has been consensus, at least through the engagements that I've had, the officers has had rather, with private sector players, that we don't have to be all over the place. Let's isolate sectors that give us the best opportunity to recover as soon as possible. And that's how we came about with those, the network industries, as sectors that presents a pristine opportunity for us to, if you like, to ensure that we get the economy on a different plane going forward. And then the third one, what makes this different is that in that spirit of us working together, then private sector got to fund capacity to help us to do this project preparation exercise. So essentially what the MDB have done, in particular here, the NDB and the World Bank and the DBSA, was to fund some of the most eminent and reputable practitioners in those sectors to help us with the project preparation. So as we're receiving projects from SOEs, provinces, and municipalities, we had a structure designed along those the network industries plus agriculture and human settlement. So you had on a daily basis people meeting with wealth of experience, just examining these projects and helping them to get to a financial close. So the point I'm making is that there has been that collective desire to work together. We have been evaluating these projects through the lenses of an investor. So it's not us just alone, but an investor at the table and say, but these are the kind of questions you need to answer. This is how best it can be packaged going forward. So Bruce, I think for me, those are the three distinguishing characteristics of the work that we have done to date. And I think that it augurs well going into the future, because it is our intention to ensure that we institutionalize this. I mean, I was sharing with the president after we finished the roundtables that the commercial banks in this country have offered the following. They say, we'll give you capacity. We've got three options of doing that. One, you can use us as sounding board. Two, we can second people who are within our ranks to come and work with you. Or three, which is a preferred option, we can fund retired professionals to come and work with you over a period of 12 to 24 months. As the state, parallel to that, begins to create its own capacity. But some of the new recruits can shadow some of these retired experts to see how you do project preparation and packaging. And for me, I think that's meaningful. I think it's profound that the private sector is making those offers, those gestures, precisely because they want to see a South Africa that is successful. And I'm sure
will they be taken up on that offer though? Because I remember when
Yes.
Tom Boardman retired from Nedbank, I said to him, what are you going to do now? He said, I'm going to work tirelessly to make sure that there's a chartered accountant in every single municipality in the country. And I think he got 6 months into it and just got so bored and frustrated about it that he just couldn't do it because there was so much resistance.
Yes. Yes.
So are we mature enough now to actually do that level of collaboration?
Yes, yes. And I think it's because, I mean, DM is here. I won't speak on his behalf, but I think National Treasury is keen that we do that. The president has been at the forefront. Minister Delil, who's an executive authority responsible for infrastructure, has been the one who has been canvassing some of these requests. And we have said to the private sector that we're going to take you up on that offer post the 23rd, post today. We will do that. I'm sure, Bruce, if we are to have this conversation in the next month or so, I'll be able to point at the number of people who are working with us to ensure that we are able to improve this capacity over a period of time. And I'm saying that, I mean, if you like, I mean, at the risk of repeating what others were saying, almost a cliche, is that the silver lining in this dark cloud is that it has imposed that requirement that public and private sector work together to resolve what is essentially a South African problem. And like I said, I think it augurs well for the future.
Thank you, Jose Ramokgopa. I'm going to take that as your closing statement because I think it's a nice pertinent point in which to end. Deputy Minister, let's get your last 1 minute thoughts. If I was to give you a 6-month timeline as to where you believe you can be as Deputy Minister of Finance, and everybody gets the similar question, where will we be 6 months from today in terms of the massive infrastructure drought that we have suffered for so long? Does rain fall in the next 6 months? Just checking if the Deputy Minister is still with us or we lost the Deputy Minister. I think we may have lost him. Let's go to you then, Patrick Dlamini. And if the Deputy Minister rejoins, we'll get him to answer that question. 6 months from now, where do we see South Africa from an infrastructure perspective?
I think 6 months from now, Bruce, is quite important that we must have prioritized the absolutely critical projects that we want to push with everything we have, together with the private sector, so that at least we can be able to see the turning of sorts in terms of those infrastructure. I think that is going to go a very long way in building the confidence and also in building the trust in the investment community that South Africa means business. We also have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that is also coming up. South Africa is best positioned on the continent to take full advantage of this, but we have to make sure that we then are able to roll out the requisite infrastructure network so that the trade and the supply chain channels are then open for that to happen. But at the same time, I think what is going to be key, given the current limitations in terms of the central fiscals, the reprioritization of budgets as we hear tomorrow, plus also the crisis that actually has dislocated the capital markets. I think that the collateralized funding instruments for municipal bonds, this is now outside the big 3 or the big 5 municipalities. to say the secondary municipalities, how do we make sure that they can be able to access serious financing so that they can be able to drive the strategic infrastructure within these municipalities? There is about a number of them that really can be able to make sure that this happens. Because at this point in time, JSE and capital markets are not in a position to do that. But if you can be able to come up with a mechanism working with National Treasury and also even engaging with the Reserve Bank to say, because in the US, the Fed is extremely active in the space in terms of the municipal bonds with some incentives that can unlock an untold level of funding by the private sector. And also you can also be able to come up with the collateralized bond obligations, which will create the secondary markets and the tradability of these financial instruments. I think those to me will be extremely, extremely innovative projects to make sure that there is funding and there is liquidity in the markets for us to get these things going.
Patrick Dlamini at the Development Bank, thank you very much. Magda Wierzicka, let's give you a minute or so. But because you're going to become a TV star now, we need you also to understand time limits. So in a minute or so, I mean, where would you like to see us 6 months from now?
Bruce, I think, the issue of infrastructure spend is, such a complicated and complex one that, I don't think we are going to make massive amounts of progress in a very short period of time, which is 6 months. But what I would like to see happen is, for one big project to be dealt with, or one big issue to be dealt with in this period, and at least for a framework to be designed. And, there's nothing better on the table than ESCOM right now. And what I would really love to see in the next 6 months is a private public sector collaboration framework for how to resolve electricity issues in South Africa. And really, the 6 months can only be spent on planning rather than on anything else, because it's too short term. But if we can design a really good plan around both the debt issues associated with ESCOM, but also electricity delivery plan going forward and energy delivery going forward, I think we would have made great strides and restored some of this kind of lack of trust from the private sector that we are facing. There, short.
Thank you, Magda Wierzicka. Very good. You win the prize for punctuality today. And on to you, Leslie Marsdorp from the New Development Bank. Your perspective, can we do anything meaningful in 6 months?
Bruce, I've spent the last 5 years in China. 6 months is a second, and that is the perspective and the way people look at the world. 6 months is way too short a period for us to make any pronouncements. At the best, we can have some momentum in 6 months. Number two, Dr. Ramaphosa has a very critical role in government now to centralize all of these various initiatives. At least if we can get that office properly capacitated, that'll be a major start. Number three, we have to open up new investment in renewable energy. These programs are ready. They are independent power producers ready. We know they are ready because they come to us for financing. We've got to open up and make sure that the supply of energy is there. But when the economy can grow again, that the necessary infrastructure is in place. Bruce, it's very important to recognize that our economy is going to go through a protracted recession. 6 months is obviously the end of the year, but for a couple of years, we will be in negative growth territory. This infrastructure is about enabling us to come out of the next 2 to 3 years of negative growth, and hopefully by year 4 to be able to have that. So we need to work on the momentum.
And I think, Leslie Marsdorp, we're possibly losing you. Oh, no, you're back. You're back. But anyway, I think the line is getting ropey. The line is getting tired. Leslie Marsdorp, thank you very much indeed. Nazmeera Moola, it could be the final word to you this afternoon in a minute-ish. Give me a short-term view.
Bruce, I think we need some. I mean, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think we need a quick win, at least one, if not a few more. And electricity, I agree with Magda, is a good place to start. If we can't get ESCOM entirely resolved, what I think is much easier to resolve is opening up the renewables program to all sorts, whether that is REAP 5, whether that's self-procurement, whether that's direct procurement or municipal procurement. And Cape Town municipality is still taking the DMR to court last time I heard, maybe not. But we shouldn't be muddling through all these issues. It is quite straightforward to sort out renewable procurement in South Africa. And that, I think, can be achieved in 6 months if the focus is there. So I think if we can do that together with capacitating, to use Leslie's wonderful word, Dr. Ramokgopa's office, then I think we will have ourselves in a position where we can go into 2021 focusing on getting a lot more projects done in areas like the water sector.
Nazmira Muller, thank you. I think we've lost the Deputy Finance Minister. Just one last check. Is David Masondo there? No, excellent, Deputy Minister. Then it's appropriate that maybe you wrap it all up for us. Give us a perspective as to realistically what we can expect in the next 6 months.
No, let me state what I hope for. My hope in the next 6 months, Bruce, it's if we could restore some level of business confidence. I mean, if the business confidence is, if you had to measure it from 0 to 10, if it could be at least at 3-4 point in the next 6 months, it will be great. And we can only restore business confidence by the actions that we undertake. And therefore, if there are projects that are ready and there's some sign of implementation, I'm not talking about completion of some of the projects that we basically have, I do think that this will give some confidence. People will be spending money into those projects. People will be getting back to work. We may in a better position to improve some business confidence. And I fully agree that there's also supply side issues. Electricity, our network industries should start to do some concrete work, function, in order for us to basically improve the business confidence, which is at its lowest in the last 45 years.
Deputy Minister, thank you very much. To all of our panelists, thank you very much. To those of you who tuned in to be with us this afternoon, thank you very much for doing so. And yeah, we are in a state of emergency. Their time for discussion is over. Some of you may be a little bit depressed by the fact that we still feel like we're taking baby steps in a direction, but for the rest of you, hopefully what you are seeing is an energized state that is actually understands the extent of the problem that we find ourselves in and is at least expressing a willingness to collaborate and to cooperate, which is a vast change on where South Africa was finding itself 3 years ago. Take yourself back to 3 years ago and imagine that administration trying to take us out of the mess that we're in right now. And I think we'll thank our lucky stars. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bruce.